We think of public office as just a job, but it's so much more than that, right? It's this deep, fundamental contract of trust between us, the people, and those in power. We give officials the authority to run huge parts of our lives, from the courts to the streets. But what happens when that trust gets broken? What are the invisible guardrails that are supposed to hold all that power in check? Well, today, we're going to find them.
Now, when you hear the term official misconduct, your mind probably jumps straight to the big stuff, right? Huge corruption scandals, briefcases full of cash, secret backroom deals, the kind of thing that makes the front page. But what about the offenses that are, well, less flashy, but can be just as corrosive? What happens when an official just decides not to follow a lawful order, or abandons their post, or steps way outside of their designated role? Well, it turns out there's an incredibly detailed legal framework, a sort of rule book for public conduct, designed to handle exactly these kinds of violations.
So here's the best way to picture it. Imagine every single public office comes with this invisible blueprint. And this isn't just your standard job description. Nope. It's a full-on structural plan that spells out the absolute limits of power, the exact scope of responsibility, and the precise ways an official has to interact with other parts of the government and, of course, with us. In short, it's a blueprint for accountability. And today, we're going to unroll this thing and take a really close look at its most important parts.
Okay, so our roadmap through this blueprint is going to cover 5 critical areas. We'll kick things off with the absolute foundation, the chain of command. Then we'll look at the timeline of duty in holding down the fort. After that, we'll explore the boundaries of power with staying in your lane, before we get into the real human cost of abuse in power and its perils. And finally, we'll see who's supposed to be guarding the gates of public service itself in unlawful appointments and advances. All right, let's dive in.
First up, let's talk about the absolute bedrock of, well, pretty much any organization that actually works, the chain of command. For anything to function, whether it's a tiny local agency or the entire federal judiciary, there has to be a clear hierarchy. There has to be this shared, fundamental understanding that if a superior gives a lawful order, it gets followed. The moment that simple principle breaks down, the entire system can just seize up.
So, the first big no-no we see in this blueprint under Article 231 is something called open disobedience. Picture the government like a giant, super complex machine with thousands of interlocking gears. A lawful order is the signal that tells one specific gear to turn, which then makes another gear move, and so on. Open disobedience? That's when a key gear just stops. It flat out refuses to turn. It's a judge or an executive official looking at a perfectly valid order from their boss and openly saying no. And we're not talking about a delay or a misunderstanding here. This is a conscious, outright refusal that can grind the whole machine to a halt.
But, it's not always just a simple no. The law always has its twists and turns, right? So on one hand, you've got that direct, in-your-face refusal. Bam, done. But on the other hand, covered by Article 232, you have a totally different scenario. Let's say an officer gets an order they think is improper. The system actually has a check for that. They can suspend the order and appeal it to their superior. But what if the boss looks at it and says, nope, I was right, the order stands, get it done? If the officer still refuses to comply, well, that becomes a whole different crime. It's defiance that's already been put to the test and failed. It's a refusal on steroids.
Okay, so let's break this down a bit. The act itself is simple enough, refusing the order. But the mindset, that's the real key. In legalese, they call it mens rea, which basically just means a guilty mind. The officer can't just be confused. They have to be intentionally defying what they know is a valid order. And the damage? It cuts 2 ways. It obviously undermines the boss's authority, but it also throws a huge wrench in the gears of government. And this is where it gets really interesting, because it shows you the main defense. The order itself has to be legit. If an officer can prove the command was illegal or the person who gave it had no authority, then it's not a crime to disobey. The blueprint demands obedience, but only to lawful commands.
And this whole idea of duty, it doesn't just stop with your direct boss. You got to think of government as this massive ecosystem where different agencies have to work together. But what happens when one part refuses to help another? That's where Article 233, the offense of refusal of assistance, steps in. This law basically says that government isn't a bunch of separate silos, it's a network. A prosecutor might need records from a city agency. A police officer might need help from the fire department. This law says you must provide that help when asked by a competent authority. Refusing is like tearing a hole in the very fabric that holds the whole thing together. Now, the law is actually pretty smart about this. The penalty isn't just one size fits all. Oh no. It all comes down to the consequences. As you can see, if an officer's failure to help just causes a little paperwork headache, no serious damage done, the penalty is pretty minor. But if that same no leads to something catastrophic, like a criminal investigation falls apart, crucial evidence is lost, or a vital public service breaks down, the punishment just skyrockets. The message is loud and clear. Your actions or inactions have serious consequences.
Okay, so we've talked about following orders, but accountability isn't just about what you do, it's also about when you do it. Public service comes with a really strict timeline, a clear beginning, middle, and end. So this next part of the blueprint is all about holding down the fort, but, and this is key, only for your assigned shift. So check out this timeline. It basically maps out an official's career and all the ways it can go wrong. First off, you can't jump the gun. Under Article 236, Anticipation of Duties, it's illegal to start your job before you take the oath or file a bond. Those aren't just for show, they're the legal acts that officially tie you to your duty. Second, you can't overstay your welcome. Prolonging performance, from Article 237, is when an officer refuses to leave after their term is over. It's basically an illegal power grab. And finally, you can't just ghost everyone. Article 238, Abandonment of Office, means you have to stay at your post until your resignation is officially accepted. You can't just walk away and leave a vacuum.
And let me tell you, the law gets really serious about abandonment when the reason behind it is shady. If an officer leaves their job specifically to get out of their duty to prosecute or punish a major crime, the penalties get way, way harsher. It's seen as a deep, profound betrayal. The ship's captain analogy is perfect here. It's not just abandoning the ship, it's abandoning it because you see the pirates coming and you don't want to deal with the fight. It's the ultimate act of desertion when you're needed most.
Okay, now we're getting to one of my favorite parts because it's so fundamental to, well, everything, the separation of powers. The whole idea is to prevent any one person or group from getting too powerful, so authority is carefully divided up. Each part of the government has its own job, its own responsibilities, its own lane. And believe me, this blueprint has some super strict traffic laws about staying in it.
So, just as a quick refresher, here are the three big lanes. You've got the legislative branch. They're the ones who make the laws. Then you have the executive branch. They enforce the laws. And finally, the judicial branch. They interpret the laws and settle fights about them. It's like a three-legged stool. Take one leg away, or make one leg do another's job, and the whole thing comes crashing down.
So what do we call it when someone crosses into another lane? The crime is called usurpation. This is when an officer from one branch illegally grabs the powers of another or just blocks another branch from doing its job. Honestly, the best way to think about it is like a basketball game. You've got players and you've got a ref. Usurpation is when a player decides, hey, I'm the ref now, and starts calling fouls on the other team. It doesn't just break a rule, it completely delegitimizes the entire game. And that's exactly what these laws prevent in government.
So the law gets specific here, breaking usurpation down into three main flavors. First, under Article 239, an executive officer can't grab legislative powers. A mayor can't just invent a new tax or decide to ignore a law they don't like. That's the legislature's job. Second, Article 240 says a judge can't just start acting like the executive branch. A judge's job starts when a case comes to them. They can't act like a police chief and just order an arrest out of nowhere. And third, and this one is a really big deal, Article 241 says an executive officer cannot act like a judge. A police captain can't hold a trial and declare someone guilty. That power belongs only to the courts.
Okay, we need to shift gears a little bit here. So far, a lot of what we've talked about are procedural rules, following orders, sticking to a timeline, staying in your lane. They're like the structural supports in the blueprint. But this next section, this is different. This is where we get into the stuff that has a real, direct, human cost. This is where the blueprint is all about protecting people from the abuse of power, and where the danger of unchecked authority gets frighteningly real.
And there is no starker example than the offense of maltreatment of prisoners under Article 235. I mean, think about it. When someone is in custody, whether they're awaiting trial or serving a sentence, they are completely and totally vulnerable. So this law draws a very, very bright line. It says the job of the officer in charge is custody, not judgment. Period. They cannot dish out any punishment that isn't officially authorized, and they sure as heck can't inflict punishment that's cruel or humiliating. The second a guard decides to be judge, jury, and punisher, the rule of law has vanished.
And this is where the law puts its foot down hard. If any of that maltreatment is done to try and force a confession out of someone, the penalty literally doubles. Why such a huge jump?
Because that's not just hurting a person anymore, you're poisoning the entire system of justice. A confession that's beaten out of someone is worthless. It corrupts the investigation, leads to wrongful convictions, and completely undermines the search for truth. It's basically sabotaging the very idea of a fair trial from the inside.
All right, for our last section, we're going to the front door of public service. We're talking about the gatekeepers. How does this blueprint make sure the right people get in, and how does it protect us from the ones who abuse their power once they're there? This final part is all about guarding those gates.
First on the list is something called unlawful appointments under Article 244. See, public jobs have legal requirements for a reason, to make sure people are competent. This offense goes after any public officer who knowingly appoints someone who doesn't meet those legal qualifications. And the magic word here is knowingly. This isn't about making an honest mistake. It's about deliberately putting someone who isn't qualified into a position of public trust. The analogy of knowingly hiring an unlicensed pilot to fly a plane is perfect. You're not just breaking a rule, you're endangering everyone. And finally, we come to a law that deals with one of the ugliest abuses of power imaginable. Now, the legal term in Article 245 is a bit old-fashioned, abuses against chastity. But what it's about is incredibly current and clear. It's about a public officer using their authority to solicit or make unwanted sexual advances. And the law is really specific. It applies when a woman has a case in front of that officer or when she's in their custody. These are situations of extreme power imbalance, and this law is there to build a firewall against that kind of exploitation.
So as we roll this blueprint back up, what's the big takeaway? Well, what we've seen is that this isn't just a random list of rules. It's this super detailed, intricate design that defines the chain of command, the timeline of duty, the separation of powers, and the absolute limits on authority. And it's all there for two big reasons. First, to keep the government machine running smoothly, and second, and way more important, to protect the dignity and the rights of every single one of us.
And that really leaves us with one last big question, doesn't it? We have this blueprint. It's clear, it's logical. The rules are right there in black and white. So, why does this stuff still happen? And what does that tell us about the systems that are supposed to be enforcing these rules? Because having a blueprint is one thing, but building something that actually works and stays working, well, that's the real challenge, isn't it? Thanks for joining me.